Okay, so we're going to talk about small group communication now. And small group communication is actually one of my favorite contexts of communication because dyadic communication is very important in our lives, those relationships that we have that are sustained over a long period of time. If you don't have good interpersonal communication, you will not have quality interpersonal relationships. But from a communication perspective, small group communication is exciting because it's so complicated. There's so many different varieties of connections that you can have. There's actually a nice little graph in your textbook that talks about the fact that in a group, there are times when you and I would talk interpersonally and somebody would just listen in. There's times when the communication becomes fractured. If you have 4 people, 2 people begin to speak dyadically and another 2 people begin to speak dyadically. Sometimes 3 people are speaking and another person is just kind of listening in, those kinds of things. Roles begin to develop, leaders, people who are functionally serving as taskmasters, making sure that we're accomplishing tasks. Other people who are there to actually really establish strong relationships. Perhaps you make a comment in your group and for some reason Brenda just glosses right over it. And if Eric were here today in your group, he might say something, well, let's go back to what Brooke just said. And that could be both task or even relational in that, because they're actually establishing, you know what, let's value the things that Brooke says. All right, so small group communication is exciting in that one. All right, in your text, they actually give a definition on page 228, and there's some important attributes of exactly when do we stop having interpersonal communication and start having small group communication. Thankfully, it's pretty doggone clear. If it's just 2 people that are communicating, that's dyadic communication, also known as interpersonal communication. All right. Once you have more than 2, so 3 or more people in a group, that's when you're starting to move into small group communication. And usually texts do not put a limit on small group communication. It's problematic, though, once you have a group that moves past 12, 13 in size, it's problematic to really continue to see this as purely small group communication. And we'll get to why in just a second. But there's never really a cap on it because it depends on what kind of communicators you are to how large that cap can get. One reason why it gets problematic once you move past 12 or 13 is because in order for it to truly be a small group, it has to be an interdependent type of relationship. All right, so interdependence speaks to the fact that the inputs or the outputs of a person will be missed or felt if they're present or absent. All right, so for instance, I already pointed out that Eric is not here in class today. You 2 are aware of that, aren't you? Were you aware of that? Because he's not a member of your group. He's not somebody that the inputs and outputs of Eric being present or absent doesn't matter to you, right? So to a certain extent, this class is a small group, a temporary small group. We all have same goals to learn this material, to end up being able to prove that we've learned the material, get an A, a B, a C, etc. Hopefully nobody set a goal for getting a D in this class. Right? So that's no, all right. No, yeah, because if you get a D in this class, I'll see you in the fall again. Glad to have you, but you save a little money if you just get a C in that. All right. So interdependence is the inputs and outputs of the group members will be felt. All right. So for instance, I really perceive myself as being a member of a small group known as Steeler Nation. And whenever I travel, I always wear my Steelers jersey in the hopes that I will strike up conversation with other Steelers fans. And I am wearing my Roethlisberger jersey again, despite all of the drama that's going on with him this summer. All right, so that gets a lot of conversation. All right, but when the Steelers show up to play their game, their opening game this season, Hines Ward is not going to look around the sideline and go, "Where's Johnny?" Right? So although I speak of the Steelers as we won this weekend, and I see myself as part of the team to some degree, they do not see me as part of the team. They don't want, Ben Roethlisberger does not want me blocking for him, believe me. All right? So interdependence speaks to the fact that your inputs and outputs are felt. And then also that you have some kind of similar goal. And it's not always task-oriented. Sometimes it is relationship-oriented. Small groups at churches are often there to serve a purpose of creating a real connection amongst people, particularly when a church starts to grow in size. They'll have home groups or small groups because it creates a relationship amongst that church. So relationship can be one of the goals. Or tasks. When you all get together, one of your tasks is, let's decide on what our group introduction is going to be. Let's decide on how our transitions will look and how we'll wrap things up. So you have tasks that you want to accomplish as well. A shared goal. And that's small group communication. All right. So we kind of spoke about this already. In any communication transaction, there will always be two major functions that are being accomplished. Task elements and also relational elements. So those task elements are those functional things that we need to accomplish. The work that needs to be done. But a balanced group is going to remember, hey, there's more to life than just getting work done. It's about people, all right? So the relational element is going to be a huge portion of any communication transaction that you have as well. Now here's the warning. It tends to be that men are more task-oriented. And it tends to be that women are more relationally oriented. And it's good to have a balance. Okay? So if you are a man, be sensitive to the fact that if you get in a group and you're doing group work, and the entire time you're like, okay, here's what we need to do. We'll meet again on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. You bring the hammer and nails, whatever it might be, right? And at no point in time do you ever take the time to say, I really appreciate your input on that. Thanks for that idea. If you see that somebody is really downtrodden and you're like, well, that's just a bunch of drama I don't want to have to deal with. It's important for you to have some balance in your communication, all right? Not only in your small groups, but also in other transactions. And then it'd be the same thing for our women, and you might want to balance a little bit more towards also remembering, hey, if you've got 15 minutes to accomplish some tasks for getting your group work done, it'd be nice if you don't just talk about how you got your shirt on sale for $4.99 at Ross Dress for Less this weekend. All right? So that you can also be a little more task-oriented. And of course, I'm speaking about gender communication. Usually at this point in time, I'll have somebody who will raise their hand and be like, that's not me. I'm a woman and I'm all about getting the task done. There are always exceptions to the rules. Okay? So these are general guidelines, and you just want to make sure you balance yourself. All right. Some obstacles to solid group work. One of the big obstacles to group work is groupthink. All right, groupthink is when you actually get together and you have this opportunity for all of you to have a different perspective and different ideas on a situation. And that little bit of tension and conflict that you might feel tends to produce better results. But if you get a bunch of people together who see the world in exactly the same way, you don't really generate the benefits that group work can usually give you. All right, so some of the reasons why this happens is insulation. All right, perhaps the group itself has no concern whatsoever for things that happen outside of itself. And in fact, many cults, this is a picture of David Koresh, for those of you who don't remember, he was a guy that ended up dying in a huge ball of fire along with many of his believers down in Waco, Texas years ago. All right, so many cults, they deliberately create insulation because they don't want you to have concerns outside of the group itself. They want you to be isolated from the outside world so that their leaders can have more power and sway over you. All right? So, for instance, in many cults, the first thing they'll do is they'll ask you to sell all of your possessions and then to give those finances to the actual cult itself. All right? And I'm sure there's some selfish motives in that. Hey, we want to turn a profit and maybe get a little bit wealthy. But the real chief motive of that is now you become completely dependent upon the leaders within that community for your sustenance, and you no longer have to look outside of the community in any way whatsoever. They deliberately create insulation so that they can control the group. Okay?
And you no longer have physical possessions that tie you to any other event or any other people.
Exactly. There's no concern that you have outside of those walls. All right? And any report that you get on things that happen outside the walls comes from leadership itself. All right? So it's filtered. All right, so when a group becomes concerned only with a group's concerns and doesn't think about what happens externally, the implications of their decisions externally, it tends to lead towards groupthink and tends to lead towards bad decision making. All right. When you have incredibly strong and persuasive leadership, it tends to lead towards groupthink. Right? So perhaps some of you have experienced this in your groups where somebody comes out with an idea and they're the smart kid in the group. They're the person who's dynamic. They're the person who tends to dominate the conversations and talk the most. Maybe you kind of were hesitant about one of those ideas that they had. But because the person is such a powerful leader and a strong leader, you don't actually contribute those reservations or supplement or expand upon their ideas because you're just like, well, that kid knows it all. I'll just follow, whatever. Okay? So really incredible, strong leadership can sometimes create groupthink. Right? So if you are a person who feels that you're a natural leader, you want to think about that. How much am I generating conversation in my groups? Maybe I am a dynamic and charismatic person, but how much have I listened to other ideas? How much have I said, okay, here's one possibility. How can we make that better? Generating conversation is really what will make you an effective leader, as opposed to just spewing information. All right? So leadership can cause groupthink. Lack of procedures can also cause groupthink. All right, so a couple of things. We're going to talk about brainstorming here in a second. Deliberately trying to generate multiple ideas, brainstorming. But another procedure that you can put into place is something that's known as a devil's advocate. If you find that your group just gets along so doggone well and you see the world in the same way, then you can literally say, okay, for the next 25 minutes, I want you to shoot holes in every idea that we come up with. Find the weaknesses in every idea. And then you're playing the role of devil's advocate. And since people understand that that's what you're doing, they're not going to get upset with you for shooting out their ideas. They're like, okay, here's a way for us to refine that idea now that you found a hole in it. If you're a person who's assuming the role of devil's advocate and nobody knows that that's what you're doing, you're what they call a pain in the rear, all right? So make sure that people understand that you're trying to contribute to the process by fulfilling this role, right? So procedures are one thing that can help to overcome. When people come from similar backgrounds, it also tends to lead towards groupthink. All right, so for instance, in this class, community colleges are wonderful, particularly in the summer, because what we see is a wide variety of demographics here. All right, we see folks who are straight out of high school, and we see returning students who are in our class. This helps us to not have that same problem that they have at a lot of institutions, where everybody is 19 years old. They've all come to college for the same kind of reasons, those kinds of things, we're similar backgrounds. But still, if you look around the room, we're all much more similar than we are different. Right? Most of us would probably identify chiefly as our culture is un-American. Right? Most of us probably listen to rock and roll. Most of us probably come from similar economic backgrounds, etc. So we're much more alike than we are different. And this lack of diversity tends to lead towards groupthink. All right, so as an example, a few years ago, David Stern and some of his administrative executives decided that they were going to adopt a new basketball in the NBA. All right? And this new basketball, the old basketballs used to have seams that would meet in the middle, and they were made of a different material. They had more panels on it than these basketballs. So they decided that they were going to do this for a couple of reasons. One, studies had shown that this design was actually more aerodynamically sound. Right? So one thing they were concerned with was that the United States had just gone into the Olympics, and basketball is the American sport that we dominate on the international stage more than any other sport. All right? But we were embarrassed. I think it was in Athens. I can't remember which Olympics it was. But the United States had gone, and they did not win gold. In fact, I think they only brought home bronze. I can't really remember.
Yeah, you're right. It was bronze. You didn't work together.
Yeah, this is a major tragedy. Yeah, it was bad. There was some team problems there. But their shooting percentage in the United States in the NBA has been going down and down and down. All right? So they thought, well, let's improve our shooters. let's improve our shooting percentage by adopting a ball that's more aerodynamically sound so that field goal percentage will go up. And also, this basketball was more similar to the ball that they use in the international arena. So when our players get used to using this ball, it won't be an adjustment when they start to compete internationally. All right, so that's one reason. Also, field goal percentage leads to higher points. It tends to be that people enjoy offense more than defense.
Yeah.
So higher scoring games would likely lead to bigger attendance, which should lead to more money. All right, so it's a money-driven business decision, reputation-driven decision. The problem was all of these people who were from similar backgrounds, who were looking at the numbers, never asked the players what they thought. Never had the players play with the ball before they instituted it as the ball. All right, and here's what was happening. The ball players hated it. One thing that was happening was this new material was literally shredding their fingertips. All right? If you're a ball player and your fingertips are getting shredded off, do you think you can enjoy this basketball? No, not at all. Okay? So what happened was the players actually ended up complaining, and what they decided to do was after the All-Star game that season, which was halfway through the season, instead of using this ball, they would go back to the old ball. This is an example of top-down decision-making, where you don't actually get the stakeholders' concerns and interests. So it's an example both of having similar backgrounds, a bunch of business-minded people, and insulation, because they don't think about the implications of what happens to their decisions outside the group. All right, so this leads to groupthink. All right, so I actually really feel that this little portion of the lecture right here is one of the top 5 things that I can teach you as students that will make you better students, better citizens, better people in your homes. Brainstorming. All right? Too many times people start to generate ideas without having any systematic procedures at all. All right? So brainstorming is a process that I want you all to deliberately use when you're generating ideas for speeches, papers, etc. All right? The big thing is you need to know that you have 2 halves of your brain, the critical side of your brain and the creative side of your brain. When you're brainstorming, you need to fire the critic. Because if you try to use both sides of your brain, the synapses will be firing at different times and in different places, and you're going to get exhausted a lot more quickly, and the creator will never be able to dominate the conversation the way that it needs to. Your critic actually kills your creator. So you just need to shut that critic up. You just do a data dump on a piece of paper. Okay, I want to think of persuasive speech ideas that I can come up with. And you just literally start to dump all of the possible ideas on a piece of paper for 10 to 15 minutes. And if you put something down like this, turtle stew, the critic has no job. The critic doesn't get to go, oh, what? What's turtle stew got to do with anything? No one's going to be interested in that. You don't know anything about turtle stew. That's stupid. The critic has no job whatsoever. Okay? So when you get together in groups or when you're working alone, fire your critic and only be the creator. Now, with that said, don't turn brainstorming into an opportunity for you to become the group comedian. All right? Where you're literally beginning to throw out the most irrational and irreverent ideas that you possibly can just so that you can get a laugh. Take the brainstorming seriously and throw out ideas that you believe will be connected to persuasive speeches if you think that that's something that's valuable. Okay? Don't become the group comedian. But try to be as creative as possible. All ideas during this stage are good ideas. You do not evaluate them until later. All right? So just data dump, throw it out there. You never know where it might lead. And feel free to hitchhike off of other people's ideas. All right, so for instance, if we're talking about summer vacation plans and you suggest that we could go up to the mountains. And then I say, oh, well, we could go up to Cascade. That's not your time in the group to go, that was my idea. I said the mountains, Cascades in the mountains. All right? No, that's hitchhiking. And it's an important part of the process where somebody will take something that you said and then you go ahead and build on that idea. Perhaps explain that a little bit deeper, clarify a little bit more, with a little more specificity. Or perhaps you've even just repeated the idea. All right? So it's okay. Be persistent. What you'll find is usually during the brainstorming process, the first few minutes of it, you'll start to data dump things very, very quickly, and they tend to be the ideas that are the most obvious and most superficial. If you'll embrace that little silent period where the ideas, it's like popcorn popping. At first, that popcorn will be popping very, very quick, and then you'll only get a few pops towards the end. Keep working until the popcorn is no longer popping. All right? Be persistent, because those ideas that come later tend to be the ideas that are not so obvious, tend to be a little bit more deeper and a little bit more helpful. So continue that process all the way through the popcorn not popping. Then what you do, once you're done with that, you usually have somebody that's actually writing down ideas in your group if you're doing brainstorming. That person is trying to group ideas together. All right, so that there's some theme. Okay, well, here's our outdoors vacation plan. Here's our museum vacation plans. Here's our traveling internationally vacation plans. They try to group those ideas together. All right? And then, that once you're done with that, that's when you will finally commit to letting your critic have a job. You'll look at all of your ideas and go, nope, we can't do this because there's no way we can fit this in a 6 to 8 minute presentation. We can't do this because it would be way too offensive to people in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's when your critic finally has a job, right? All right, so that's a little bit on actual small groups and things that happen in those groups. Now we're going to talk a little bit about leadership and conflict, those kinds of things. All right, so in your text there's a definition of small group leadership, and they say the ability to direct or influence others' behaviors. And what we want you to know in a communication class is that this is a communication process. True small group leaders are going to help to manage the conversation, help to guide and direct the conversation. Oh, what Brooke said seems like a pretty good idea. What other ideas might we have about him? That's guiding and directing things, all right? It's not somebody who actually pulls people along, but guides and directs them. All right, group conflict. Hopefully, we're far enough along in this class. I've actually put the small group lecture further in the class than I usually do because I'm hoping that by now your group has experienced some of these different stages. Group conflict is something you should expect. In the United States, we tend to think of the word conflict pejoratively. How was class today? Oh, we had lots of conflict. The person who hears that is immediately going to say something like this. Oh, that's too bad. What went wrong? Truly, conflict is something that you should expect and embrace. It tends to be when you start to have a clash of ideas that that's when you start to grow and develop. Conflict is something that actually is not pejorative at all. It's something that you should actually expect and hope for in a group. All right. So there are some known stages that a group passes through. There's a fifth stage that's been added now. I think it's called the journey, and I think your group even has it. But these are the four most common stages. The forming, storming, norming, and performing stages of a group. All right, so the forming stage is when you actually begin to see yourself as a group. And this is one reason why immediately when you first get into your groups, I say choose a name. Because once you put a label on yourself, it tends to cause you to see yourself as an actual group. Once you put a label on yourself. It's one reason why we have that activity. The storming stage is when those conflicts start to arise. Where you're used to being in a group where you do most of the talking, and Michelle just keeps right on interrupting you and throwing in her ideas as well. All right, so now we're going to have a little bit of storming. Exactly what do I do in this group? How will I be seen in this group? Storming. I want to meet on Saturday at 5 o'clock. That's the only time that I can meet throughout the week. Well, Saturday I work. There's no way I can do this. So there's some storming and tension. How in the world is our group going to be able to accomplish the task that it's supposed to accomplish with the obstacles that we're meeting? Somebody who just has a personality that you can't stand, right? So storming is something that you would expect. Once you've gone through that storming stage, it tends to be that we start to have norming that occurs. Where now when you get together in groups, You pretty much know who's going to be the note taker. You know who's going to be the person who's going to put the PowerPoints together. You know who's going to be the person who's really creative and has excellent ideas. All right? Norming is when you start to have roles that are fairly well understood. You don't have to work those out at every small group meeting. And then finally, the performing stage. That's when you actually put your work out, where your inputs that you've been doing are finally felt as outputs to somebody outside of the group. Right? The performing stage. That happens for you all when you come forward and give your presentations and you have your group work that's there. All right. In my online class, their group work is evaluated in the performing stage when we do discussion board grading. How did you function as a group? Was people posting in a timely manner? Were those posts quality? Did people build off of each other's ideas? Did they challenge one another to think a little bit deeper, etc.? That's the performing stage of a group when the outputs are begun to be felt. All right, there are different styles of conflict resolution. This actually comes from that interpersonal chapter in your book too. But one of the styles of conflict resolution is just a straight-up escapist, sometimes called avoidance strategy in other texts. All right. So the escapist strategy is you're together in a group and you're sick and tired of Johnny Cheeseburger coming 15 minutes late to every single group meeting, and the only thing that he does is drip barbecue sauce all over your papers. That's his only contribution. So how do you choose to address it? You and the other group member, after the group meeting is done, go out in the hallways and go, oh, that Johnny Cheeseburger is just really upsetting me. If he comes in and drips barbecue sauce over my papers one more time, I'm just going to smack him. I swear, he should get a 0 on the assignment. Right? That's the only thing you do. You never approach Johnny Cheeseburger and say, hey, dude, why don't you show up on time and actually come with a little bit of your work done beforehand instead of me just carrying the whole load? Instead, you just talk about the person outside in the hallway, never actually directly confront them, and do everything you can to actually avoid direct conflict. The escapist or avoidance strategy is the most common strategy of conflict resolution. And it's also the most ineffective. So you're working at a business where the boss keeps making decisions that suck and that cause a whole bunch of turmoil for the people who are on the bottom rung at their corporation.
Most
Question?
of the time it just seems like pointless to do that because,
The escapist?
yeah, it just doesn't seem like it's going to change.
It doesn't get anything done, right? So in your corporation, what do? You go into the break room, you eat your ramen noodles together, and talk about how the boss's decision totally sucks.
No, I'm
nobody
talking about
ever-
confronting that person. It never seems like it's going to change.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second. All right? It tends to be that's what you do in the break room, talk amongst one another, and the boss never gets to hear about your decisions. All right, so when you're arguing from a sample of one, it tends to be that there's a limited sample and you can't draw really good conclusions from that. Institutional research has shown that the people who directly confront their bosses about their decisions tend to be the people who are most respected by their bosses and tend to be the people who are promoted at a much faster rate. Tends to be. Of course, there's a caveat to that. How do you approach your boss? Do you come up to your boss and say, Johnny, that decision you made last week totally sucks? And that's all you say? Or do you come in and say, your decision to actually reorganize the structure of the organization last week, I can see where you were going with that decision, but here's the implications to us at the ground level. I now am no longer able to have direct communication with Susie, and Susie is an important part of my job day to day. She tells me all of my appointments. She tells me exactly what kind of clients I have, and now that I don't have that communication with her, I no longer am able to fulfill my job at the same degree. So my suggestion would be that we adopt your plan but make this subtle revision. All right? That's a threefold thing. First, you've acknowledged the boss's thinking. Secondarily, you've stated clearly in descriptive fashion how that has implications for you in your job. And finally, you haven't just whined, you've actually suggested a solution.
Yeah.
3 stages. You acknowledge what the boss has done and why that boss was thinking of it. You describe the implications of it, and you suggest solutions. If you're a person who will follow that 3-pronged procedure, it tends to be that you're going to be viewed favorably by your boss. Now, there are some poor leaders out there. There are some poor bosses out there. And not every boss is going to receive that kind of criticism in the same way. So you have to make intelligent decisions about who you approach, when you approach, etc. Another thing you should be aware of is a lot of times people will immediately have a defensive reaction to the thing that you're saying. Let them. Give it a week or two. Come back and reapproach it a week or two later. And probably that person's mentality will be distinctly different. I actually had an instructor when I was an undergraduate who would not allow students to complain about grades the same day a paper had been handed out. She would simply say, I'm going to hand your papers out to you. Some of you are not going to be happy about your grade. I'm perfectly open to having a conversation with you starting tomorrow. And the reason why she did that is because your initial reaction is, I'm not a C student. I did 14 hours worth of work on this and I get a C. It's an emotional reaction initially. And then you go home and you read the comments and you go, oh, you know what? She did ask for 3 source citations and I didn't give those to them. That was 20% of my grade I missed right there. Right? So you're able to actually start to think of those things analytically. And I'm sure you've all lived that experience. Sometimes the most valuable advice that you've ever been given, or the most valuable input that you've ever been given, is the thing you disagreed vehemently with when it was initially given. Sometimes it's taken me a couple of years to value advice that somebody's given me, right? A friend of mine always has a signature on their email. The older I become, the smarter my dad gets. All right? And so basically what he's saying is, you know what, I've learned through the years that many of those pieces of advice that I thought were just totally ludicrous had a lot of value to them. But it's taken me years to amass the wisdom to actually value that advice. So, I'm not saying that you need to wait 2 years before you follow up with your boss, but don't be surprised if that initial reaction is sort of defensive, because we all own our ideas. True leaders start to get used to the idea of, I don't really own my idea, I'm proposing an idea. But there are leaders out there who still are going to react initially to criticism very, very defensively. Give it some time, follow up later. All right? And if it just doesn't work out, well, then either find a new job or learn to live with it.
I heard somebody say once that one of the first signs of emerging wisdom is the ability to recognize it in other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Where you can actually start to value the inputs of other people, right? And that's kind of back to that Ben Franklin thing, where he gives his little quote on that signing of the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, the adopting of the Constitution, where he said, you know what, I don't think this is a very good document. But the years have taught me that I'm not always right. The things that I think aren't going to work end up working out. And given the other options, I believe this is the best document that we can come up with at this time. Right? So the years will teach you these things. All right? And hopefully some of you won't have to suffer through this. So why you have classes and have education is so that right now you can say at 19 or 20 years old, you can say to yourself, you know what? I bet you there's some other people in the world who know just as much as me or maybe more. Let me listen to them. Let me consider the things that they say before I just give it the old tennis racket approach. Knock every idea right away from it. Okay? So escapist strategies, the avoidance, just never addressing, never having any direct confrontation with that, it tends to be the least effective, changes things very, very little. There's a distributive style of conflict where you basically come up with that winner and loser. You find a way to win, and you appoint a loser. And it tends to be that this is also not the ideal solution to problems. All right? If you're in a relationship where every single problem is just settled through compromise. I'll get what I want this time, you get what you want next time. If that's your strategy and the only strategy that you have, it tends to be that this is going to lead to long-term problems. It'd be better for you to have an integrative side.
Why?
Because of the fact that nobody ever really gets what they want. Right? So one person is getting what they want and another person is excluded from that solution. Next time, the other person is not getting what they want. And also, because it tends to be that in a relationship, there tends to be somebody who has a power in the relationship. And guess who wins more often? The person with power in the relationship. And then pretty soon, the person who doesn't have power in the relationship is feeling completely isolated and abandoned, and their needs are not being met ever. All right? So that promise of next time you'll get what you want never comes to fruition. All right, so it's problematic in lots of ways. And a compromised style of conflict resolution tends to be that nobody ever really gets what they want. All right, the integrative style is when everybody finds a way to win in this solution. And I've already acknowledged this in our last class that, hey, you know what, we don't all live underneath rainbows and pet our unicorns when we wake up in the morning. All right? I know that we don't live in a fantasy world, okay? So the fact of the matter is there isn't a way for everybody to always having a win-win solution, all right? So I acknowledge this, but at least strive towards that solution. You know, the idea of my wife wants to go to Disneyland, I want to go to the Smithsonian, why didn't we go to Disney World and go to Epcot? She gets to be around Mickey and Goofy. I get to, establish my nerdery a little bit when I go in there and learn about the Wright brothers, etc. All right, so integrative. Everybody gets something that they like out of that situation. All right, so some conflict strategies. Number one, simply acknowledging is a huge part of conflict resolution. A lot of times what you'll see is people will elevate their anger. Anybody who's been in customer service knows that this is the first step that they teach you. All right, to acknowledge that the person is upset. I can see that you're upset about the price that you paid for this and that it went on sale a week later. What can I do to make you happy? All right? So the acknowledging is the first step. Actually saying, you know what? You don't have to sweat anymore or shout any louder because it's clear to me that you're upset. The reason why people elevate generally is because they're trying to show you that they're upset. And until you acknowledge that they're upset, they're just going to elevate that. All right? And of course, we already talked earlier about reciprocation, that it tends to be that the person who is elevating, if you will elevate with them, then suddenly we're climbing the ladder of anger. And if instead you would simply adopt a submissive strategy, a softer tone of voice, they will tend to reciprocate with a softer tone of voice. I put myself in a submissive position now. The person is now above me, and I can talk a little softer with them. You can see that you're upset about the grade that you got on your speech. What upsets you about it? And now I'm generating a conversation with them, okay? So these are deliberate strategies you can use to manage conflict. And then reflect what they're giving in the conversation. Okay, so that you would actually restate the things that are being said, so that they understand not only that you're getting the emotional element of things, but also the task element of things. You actually reflect that to them. And this helps to manage the conflict as well. All right. So if you can tell them that you acknowledge the meaning and you can reflect the actual content of the message, it tends to help manage that conflict in a good way. Yes?
It seems that these are really common, just like most situations with conflict. And I've heard of kind of a four-step process type thing, where the first step would be listening, the second step would be acknowledgement, the third step would be clarifying, and the fourth step would be presenting a resolution.
Absolutely. Those are all perfectly appropriate steps in conflict resolution that people should be adopting systematically. And of course, that listening stage, we've taught you that listening isn't just all passive, the stuff that's hitting your ears. That acknowledging is actually sort of the paraphrasing and summarizing stage that comes back to people so they know that they've been heard. And you're trying to focus on the two key elements of it. The emotional element of the statement and the content element of the statement. Both are incredibly important in conflict resolution. Right? And you get away from you, and instead you start to describe the behaviors. Right? So it's not, Paula, you're so lazy. Instead, I would come to you if I'm trying to have good conflict resolution and say, Paula, I've been noticing lately that when you come to meetings, you don't bring a pen and a pencil and you don't bring the notes from previous meetings. This doesn't help us when we're in a group because we start to list the reason why that's important. So it's not about Paula now, it's about the actual behaviors. People tend to be a little less defensive when we're attacking the behavior and not the person.